Hello, and welcome to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. It's July 28th, 2021. Today, we are focusing on the Israeli intelligence firm NSO Group, which sells military-grade surveillance tools to authoritarian regimes around the world. A new investigation revealed a list of more than 50,000 phone numbers that had been targeted by NSO's spyware tools and included human rights advocates, journalists, and world leaders. I'm delighted to be joined today by expert analysts Yousef Munayyer and Dahlia Scheindlin. Yousef is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and Dahlia is a political strategist and public opinion expert. She is also a policy fellow at the Century Foundation. Both Yousef and Dahlia just published articles on the NSO Group. Yousef has a new piece in Jewish Currents entitled Exporting the Tools of Apartheid. Dahlia's piece in The Guardian is called Why Israel is More Concerned About Ben & Jerry's Than the Pegasus Revelations. Yousef and Dahlia, thank you for joining Occupied Thoughts today. So Yousef, I just want to start with you. Some people may, there are a lot of people who now may have NSO and Pegasus kind of, swirling around in their heads a little bit, but I think a lot of people still don't necessarily entirely understand what these entities are and what the significance of these revelations that all these journalistic entities broke over the last week or two. So maybe you can just give people a little bit of an overview about what these entities are and what's significant about this story.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Peter, for having me here to talk about this. So the NSO Group is essentially a Israeli high-tech corporation that sells its premier product is spyware. And it is one of several Israeli high-tech corporations that are involved in the sale internationally of basically this kind of technology. Their premier product, Pegasus, which is the one that has been at the center of the news that has come out about them in recent weeks, is essentially a form of technology that allows users, this is sold to states primarily, to spy on an individual's phone, and in some cases do that without having the user click on any link. Once the spyware is on your phone, they have access to conversations, files, images, and can operate reportedly your camera and your microphone as well. So this is obviously very dangerous technology. It is technology that is used for repressive purposes. It is technology that is licensed for sale by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And now this corporation, NSO Group, like so much of the Israeli high-tech industry, has very close relationships with the Israeli military intelligence apparatus. Many of the founders and staff of this group, as well as many of the other organizations and corporations that are selling Israeli technology internationally, have close relationships with the Israeli military, came through the Israeli military intelligence unit, and continue to have close ties with the Israeli military. We've known this for some time. This is not what is new. What's new and what's driving much of the reporting that we've seen in recent weeks is that there has been a leak of a very significant list of about 50,000 phone numbers that were reportedly potential targets of Pegasus users. And this is something that was analyzed by Amnesty International as well as others to find out who was on this list, who was being targeted. In the course of doing an analysis on this, they found that some 50% nearly of the phone numbers that they were able to investigate from this list had traces of the Pegasus spyware on them. People who were impacted by this included something like 14 heads of state, as well as people like Jamal Khashoggi's wife and later his fiancée, and other targets of transnational repression, which is becoming a major human rights issue as regimes are able to extend their reach beyond their borders to target dissidents in ways that was not possible before.
And just a factual question, as far as we know, are these sold only to states, or is this technology also sold to non-state actors?
It's a good question. As far as I know, it's only state actors, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are certain individuals that have close relationships with some of these regimes. You have to understand that some of these regimes are monarchical regimes,
right.
Where you have family members that are very high up within the system that may not necessarily be part of the government or operating it as part of the military intelligence. For example, the princess from the UAE, Princess Latifa, who had escaped from the UAE, was brought back, while she was in the middle of the ocean escaping by Indian commandos after she had this spyware on her phone used to sort of to track her down. And it's not really clear if that was the government or individuals within the family who are linked to the government. And I think it should go without saying that this is a pretty secretive world of work, and we have glimpses into what is going on, but it's hard to get a complete picture.
Dahlia, I wanted to turn to you. What do you think is most significant about this story and what we've learned about NSO and the way it operates?
I would agree with Yousef that in many ways we vaguely knew of this reality for a number of years in Israel. I mean, the basic principle that Israel is constantly developing weapons and tools, military tools that it's using in a sort of ongoing conflict situation, whether it's the occupation of the Palestinians, control over the West Bank, and effective control over Gaza, or other parts of the region where Israel has interests in spying or generally using its military capacity. We know that this is providing what has been called the lab for Israel's military exports. And since 2007, there's been a law for the government to supervise and regulate the sale of these kinds of weapons, and cyber surveillance of this type now counts as something that should be controlled as military exports. The Ministry of Defense is supposed to approve all of these kinds of sales. And just to add to the question about are they sold to governments or not, the Israeli government claims and the company claims that they are only sold to governments. But I think that really speaks to what Yousef was talking about, that it's a very shadowy world that emerges. I mean, the technology itself emerges from some of the most secretive units in the Israeli army. So we know that we will never really know the full ins and outs of it. And I think that what's significant about it in some senses is that Israeli society has known about this general trend, this general way that things happen, the way that these instruments are developed, the situations in which they're developed through the military establishment, and then move into the private sector from the same people who leave the army and go into the private sector afterwards, and become a major part of Israel's military exports, which is, of course, a major part of Israel's exports overall. And Israelis are basically okay with that. To my mind, the striking thing has been how little debate this has raised in Israel. We can certainly talk about it more. But in the first few days that the story broke, Israeli society certainly wasn't talking about it very much. And I think that the reaction of government officials was notably muted. They gave these kind of lackadaisical statements or sort of anodyne statements that we will look into this and we will certainly check to make sure that the sales the sales are being used by the purchasers in ways that they were intended. But it's all kind of I would say almost hinting that everybody knows that we don't really know, or we haven't tried to keep very close control, or if the highest levels of government do know, that they are downplaying it basically. And that has been, I think, the outstanding feature, because this has been such an enormous story that has really rocked the world and, set off diplomatic crises. And in Israel, it's simply not seen that way. It's just one of those, background headlines. And I think the government officials who have weighed in are basically trying to keep it that way for the most part. So that contrast has been very striking.
Sorry, the contrast.
That
Right.
contrast.
I just want to follow up on this about this kind of nonchalant kind of attitude. I mean, it seems to me these are decisions that NSO is making that have implications for Israeli foreign policy. I mean, it seems to me if the NSO is then helping people spy on the president of France, that could have an impact on French-Israeli relations. So I'm curious a little bit to ask why you think the Israeli government isn't more concerned about this. Is that just because they are generally quite happy to be having their companies spying on large numbers of people around the world? They think it benefits them, or they don't think there's going to be any blowback? I mean, help me to understand that.
Well, I think we're all trying to understand it, but when we talk about the Israeli government, I think we have to distinguish between the current government, which has only been in power for about 6 weeks, and the previous government, which was led by a prime minister who effectively conducted Israel's foreign policy, even when there was a separate foreign minister. And the foreign ministry officials are involved in the committees that basically work with the defense ministry to make their recommendations and give these approvals that we're talking about. But ultimately, at the highest levels of government know about this. And there's a lot of speculation that the prime minister himself would have had to know about this kind of thing. And he was essentially the one who determined and executed Israel's foreign policy, sometimes in very counterintuitive ways. Nobody can forget Netanyahu's willingness to challenge the American president. And there were the same questions then. Wouldn't that bother Israelis, or wouldn't that bother the government that the prime minister is being so confrontational with its closest ally? And I think this falls into the same category. Netanyahu had an attitude that he could manage foreign relations, he could take risks, he did the calculations, and he would manage the blowback. The current government is now in a position of dealing with this. I don't want to let them off the hook, of course. A number of the officials in the current government, including the prime minister at present, served as defense minister in the past. But if I have to kind of give a zoom out analytic perspective, Netanyahu generated a situation in which he took all control and in a way took all responsibility for that kind of thing. And now the new government has to decide if these are significant costs that they no longer want to incur. Having said that, I doubt it, to be honest. I mean, these are very lucrative industries, and Israel tends not to place human rights at the center of its foreign policy, to say the least. It's generally more committed to pushing back, on criticism of human rights for its own record. So I don't think they're going to let the fundamental issues that this has raised significantly constrain the decisions that it makes in the future.
Great. Yousef, you wanted to jump in?
I just want to jump in on this point and add a little bit to it, because Peter, there's a flip side to this when it comes to Israel's foreign policy as well. And the flip side is that its weapons sales and its military intelligence sales have often been sort of the foundational pieces in building and extending foreign relations with new governments, including some of the most unsavory regimes that Israel has relationships with. And I would say that while in the recent era, particularly when it comes to some of this advanced spyware technology, it really has been the Netanyahu government, just because of sort of the timeline that this took place in. But this, dynamic of, trading and building relationships with regimes, including, some very dangerous regimes, with technology that is, banned or restricted or what have you, is really a deep part of Israeli history that transcends governments. I mean, one can look at the long and prolific career of Shimon Peres himself in building relationships with governments in Africa and elsewhere, including with the apartheid regime in South Africa, through the trade of weapons and technology that was off limits to them otherwise. So this is sort of a way of doing business that has now evolved into the 21st century.
Right. And Dahlia, among in Israeli society, is there in terms of its nonchalance? Is that just is it just that because people think, well, it's a nasty, dangerous world out there. Israel, can do whatever it wants if it's in the name of its own security, or is it more because people recognize the economic value of this? There aren't any. I mean, there was a time, at least, when some Israelis wanted to just differentiate themselves from other regimes for their democratic or supposed democratic credentials. Are there not voices in Israel saying, this is beyond the pale? Some of these governments we shouldn't be supporting.
I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that you may be overestimating the extent to which Israeli society is thinking about this story at all. Mm-hmm. We should remember that on the day that it broke was last Sunday. And I believe it was on Tuesday or Monday evening, Tuesday morning, that the Ben and Jerry's story broke, and it completely swept the headlines, totally took over public attention. And, the NSO was quite drowned out by that. And there's a good reason for that, which is that I guess, the media and the editors who make these decisions didn't think it was nearly as important for Israelis. So that's one thing. It simply was drowned out by the far more symbolic issue of the potential boycott, which was actually divestment and also not really even happening until another year and a half from now, of the Ben and Jerry's story. And that is plays much more deeply into the Israeli symbolic narrative of how they look around the world. So if you're asking what Israelis care about in terms of their image, the Ben and Jerry's story hit home much more deeply. They're much more concerned that how dare the world look at us as the aggressors and want to punish us for that. The typical narrative that we hear all the time, that Israel isn't communicating its position properly and it's being misunderstood around the world. That is such a familiar story in Israel that it's almost like Israeli society just fell into the pattern of focusing on that track and not really thinking about what it means that Israel is contributing, this kind of instruments to governments that are either authoritarian in themselves or have authoritarian practices, or illiberal governments. I thought it was that simple. That was the story, that it got drowned out and into the bigger issue. The Ben and Jerry's issue took over, but I've heard some commentators go even further, and I don't entirely disagree, that to some extent Israelis may be a little bit proud. I mean, they are certainly proud of the industry. And when I say the industry, Israelis aren't thinking about the arms export industry, which I agree with Yousef again. I think that we should be looking at this. We are increasingly looking at cyber surveillance as simply part of military exports. But Israelis are looking at this as a great high-tech success, and they have nothing but pride for their high-tech industry. Again, not to give Netanyahu credit for everything, but his stump speech, pretty much at every opportunity he got to speak about Israel's achievements, involved the success of Israel's high-tech sector, especially for exports and especially for contributing wonderful innovations around the world, in which he would often talk about cybersecurity. So by that, he was referring to a kind of technology that is considered defensive security. Now I think we're all learning to distinguish between defensive and offensive cyber instruments, technology. Israelis have barely gotten their heads inside of that because they're too busy thinking about how great Israel's high-tech industry is. They also are highly aware that it is a booming industry, especially in the shadow of the Corona crisis. There's been lots of media recently about how the high-tech industry is hiring, needs more people, is offering high salaries. People can do quick trainings. There are promises that their salaries are going to double if they do quick training. And so Israelis see it as their lifeline domestically, as well as major driver of the economy that shielded Israel from the worst of the damage from the COVID economic crisis due to exports. And I think that they don't put this in the category of weapons export or supporting undemocratic regimes and how Israel looks. They put this in the category as basically a slightly less than perfect part of Israel's stunning, successful high-tech industry.
Yeah. It's interesting how, in the US too, obviously the whole startup nation storyline has been this way for, Israel supporters to essentially try to kind of turn the conversation away from those uncomfortable political and moral issues and say, no, there's just this exciting economic success story, and maybe it's great for the world because Israel creates technologies, right? But in fact, one sees here very clearly that the two things can't be disentangled, right? That is, Yousef, did I see you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I just want two things on sort of the Ben and Jerry story coming at the same time of this, which I think is important. Dahlia points out how it sort of overtook the conversation, and that's I think in large part because the Israeli government officials wanted to shift the conversation, and you can see that they were issuing statements and issuing tweets about the Ben and Jerry's issue. And not speaking much at all about the NSO issue. They wanted that to go away, and they wanted the conversation to be about Ben and Jerry's. Not that's not an important topic, but it certainly was convenient for them to shift the story here. At the same time, one of the issues that they spoke about in relation to the Ben and Jerry's decision was linked to this, I think, in an important way that says something about Israeli society and the values which are acceptable when it comes to these issues. And if you look, for example, at the foreign minister, what he said in response to one of the things that he said in response to the Ben and Jerry's issue is there are all of these laws in the United States that are against BDS, and we are going to work to push the governors to enforce these laws against activists and so on. And of course, these are laws that officials in the Israeli government, including former ministers, have taken credit for helping to pass. This is itself a form of transnational repression in a different medium, where through networks and pressure, the Israeli government is hoping to see repressive outcomes. And in this way, it's something that is totally accepted. So I think, there is a sense that this stuff is okay, this is acceptable. And I don't think Dahlia is wrong about there being a sense of pride in this as well.
I just want to add something, Peter, back to your question when you asked about, does Israel care about distinguishing itself from the non-democratic regimes? In the past, it has wanted to portray itself as more democratic. I think we have to be really clear about what we mean by that. Israel has tried to portray itself as the only democratic country in the Middle East. And what it means is for its own citizens. It has never really taken on or tried to engage in what it means to set an example of democracy in the international community. And the idea, by the way, selling weapons, back in the pre-cyber era to, very violent regimes is not new for Israel. I mean, Israel's been implicated, and it's very well publicized about selling weapon sales to South Africa under the apartheid regime. Lots of credible accusations and evidence of selling weapons to Rwanda just before the genocide, and even export to the former Yugoslavia during the wars in Bosnia, and those kinds of things. And Israel, by the way, has also made common cause and alliances with repressive regimes, even if it wasn't directly based on arms sales, going way back. Israel had relations with Ceausescu. Israel had relations with Idi Amin before that relationship changed. So I think it's always been a very realpolitik sense of whoever will be friends with Israel is good enough for us. We don't really care what kind of regime they are. Netanyahu, I think, accelerated that policy significantly in his attempt to deflect precisely the kinds of criticisms of Israel's human rights record and erosion of democracy from Western countries, from Europe and from the US, especially under the Obama era. I think he was concerned about that. That's my reading of it, given how much he accelerated his cultivating of many of these very unsavory regimes. I mean, I remember when he went to Azerbaijan for the first time in 2016, and we all, I argued at the time that he was not only trying to forge new partnerships, but that it served his interest to legitimize illiberal regimes for his own kind of leadership. I'm not saying he was exactly where the Azerbaijani regime is. That would be an overstatement, but legitimize, it's not just about having one more friend. It's also about saying these are legitimate partners. Their style of governance is legitimate for us to do business with them. At the same time, we've also pointed out that those new friendships were largely based on the promise of arms sales to Azerbaijan at the time, also cultivating relationships with India to the point where by 2017, India was the #1 purchaser of Israeli arms. It's no longer in the #1 position, but this is a fundamental part of those relationships, and it has not bothered Israel, to be frank.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the anti-BDS laws. So I think one of the there's been lots of talk over the years about the way in which Israeli government may be spying on people who are involved in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, people involved in the Palestinian solidarity world in the United States and other parts of the world. I wonder if you've seen any ways in which this NSO Pegasus story intersects with that, and if there is any evidence that we have yet about if any of this spying might actually have been on people who are protesting Israeli policies.
Well, one thing we know for sure is that there are corporations, for example, like Black Cube, which is, one that is, apparently former Mossad people that are sort of spies for hire type of services that have targeted BDS activists. That's something that has been reported. And at the same time, again, there's a lot we are not going to know about because these are state secrets. But look, if a government is licensing the sale of technology outside the country, you can pretty safely assume that not only does it have that technology, but also it's had that technology for a long time and probably has something even greater at its disposal. That's just the way that it tends to work. And the Israeli government has made no secret about having a vast interagency approach that brings together all of the tools of the state to respond to BDS activism around the world. So I think it's only a logical inference to assume that is happening. And I just wanted to say something about this, sort of question about is it surprising that Israel is sort of embedding itself among all of these authoritarian regimes? It's not surprising to Palestinians, certainly not. At the end of the day, we're talking about a country that has been running a military occupation for, more than half a century, over millions of people who have no right to vote. This is an authoritarian regime, and repression has been a key instrument inside the occupied territories, but also against Palestinian citizens of Israel historically, right? And for Palestinians who have long understood that their society, that their networks have been heavily surveilled and infiltrated, none of this was particularly surprising. I think the surprise was what's taken so long for people to realize that this is a problem.
Right.
I think in that vein, it's worth reminding listeners who may not be familiar with the fact that from the end of the War of Independence, Israel did implement a martial regime, a military government over Palestinian citizens of Israel in large population centers up until December 1966. That means that there's only ever been 6 months, roughly, in Israel's history when it was not implementing some kind of heavily surveillance-based regime.
Right. And I think, part of I think that the problem here is that we have a discourse in the United States, which tends to talk in kind of Manichaean terms between, the supposed kind of democratic world, which often just means us and our friends, and so I think if this story had turned, if it had been China that had produced the NSO group, right? I mean, you would have seen every hawkish senator and congressman literally basically saying, this proves that they're an existential threat to the United States, right? And we should, and yet in some ways this story, which shows that this techno-authoritarianism or whatever actually has multiple centers around the world, including, frankly, the United States, and doesn't necessarily respect these Cold War lines that we've drawn, I think means that it doesn't have the same effect politically in the United States, because we just classify these countries in different baskets, largely based on whether they're our friends or not.
What's so interesting about that, Peter, is that it's actually Israel's unique position as part of this sort of Western family of like-minded nations that has given it the opportunity to exploit this market, right? American and Western allies are probably not going to be buying Chinese or Russian surveillance technology. right? They're going to be buying it from people they can quote unquote trust, right?
Right.
And so the Israelis are sort of sitting at this unique intersection of being a high-tech economy, of having a population in which they could practice and refine surveillance technology in ways that other quote unquote democracies would not be able to do because of civil liberties restrictions, and a set of relationships, established relationships with Western powers that allow them to compete very effectively against the Chinese and the Russians in spaces that they don't have access to.
Right.
I would add to that and just go a little further.
I'll give you the last word, Dahlia.
Yeah, oh, sorry, no, just on this theme of what other countries do. I mean, Israel has also been cultivating China as a major trade partner, of course. And it was the Trump regime, the Trump government, I should say, I guess, that warned Israel and tried to pressure Israel to reduce the exports and limit China's investments, and specifically asked it to try to limit China's involvement in the technology sector in Israel, warning Israel that this could backfire because the Chinese would have access and possibly cause some sort of a security threat because they would have the technology to access Israeli secrets. So there's an irony there too.
Right. Terrific. This was really great. Thank you so much, Dahlia and Yousef, for our conversation. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of the Occupied Thoughts podcast, a project of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. You can visit our website at fmep.org to subscribe to our many resources and find today's podcast episode posted along with links for additional resources about this topic. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. I'm Peter Beinart. I look forward to our next episode. Thanks very much.